So this morning in Sunday school and in our reading today, we're talking a lot about stewardship issues and the rich and the poor and all that sort of thing comes into play. It reminds me of a story. There was this rich man who was very distressed about the prospect of not being able to take with him what was his after he died. So he went to his minister and he expressed his concerns about that. Why can't I take this with me? I don't like this. So they prayed about the problem and they came up with a solution. Before he died, the wealthy man went to the bank and he loaded a suitcase with gold bars from the bank vault. And when he appeared at the pearly gates, he had the suitcase in hand. St. Peter asked him, "Well, what do you have in your suitcase?" And very proudly the man opened his case to display his gold. And St. Peter said, "You brought pavement?" I knew most of you would get that. Today is Stewardship Sunday, so I thought I would share a corny stewardship joke with you. That's what it was. Now, sometimes congregations will invite a special stewardship speaker to come on this particular Sunday so that the minister doesn't have to browbeat his or her congregation about giving issues and things of that nature. Well, as a pastor, I've never been very comfortable doing that sort of thing, asking for money, telling you need to give more and that sort of thing. So for the most part, I've shied away from the stewardship theme, at least that overtly. Maybe I need to do it a little more frequently. But stewardship is something we need to talk about. It's about taking care of things. That's what the word means. That's it. It's simple as that. And we all take care of things in our lives. We take care of our families, our congregations, the mission of our congregations, other benevolences you might be involved with. You take care of your pets or your animals, your gardens, your lawns. You take care of your vehicles. We could go down the line. And we all pay taxes, and with our taxes we pay for such things as our nation's infrastructure. We take care of the elderly and the disabled. We take care of our military personnel. And we could go on down the line with that as well. I attended a stewardship conference a number of years ago. I think it's where I met John Kruger, actually. And I learned at that conference that every passage in the Bible could be construed as, or interpreted or used as a lesson on stewardship. And the readings that I shared with you today are no exception. First, there was the story of Ruth, who married a man named Boaz so that her family, including her mother-in-law Naomi, would be cared for. Because in that day, women didn't have good ways to take care of themselves in many cases, and so they needed to be married to somebody who could care for them. And it's a story about family stewardship. And then the reading from the gospel, of course, is that famous story of the poor widow who put money into the temple treasury. Sort of like we're going to be doing in a little while. We put our pledges and so forth in that little miniature church over there. And she went up there and she only had 2 small coins. Well, you may have heard them referred to as widow's mites. And the lesson of that story is that some people contribute out of their abundance, and some people sacrifice everything they have. And so this is a story about religious stewardship. I could have preached from either one of those texts, but I chose instead to use a little-known psalm for my stewardship text this morning. Psalm 127 is all about stewardship, specifically 4 particular stewardship activities. There's building, guarding, working in general, and then raising children. How are these stewardship activities? Well, we take care of or we steward people's need for shelter when we build things, particularly when we build homes. And some of you have been in the building business in your lifetime. And then there's things like Habitat for Humanity. How many of you have participated, I wonder, in Habitat for Humanity at times? Sure. Did you see the story about 91-year-old Jimmy Carter, who has a brain tumor? And he was able to go out this past week and hammer some nails at a Habitat for Humanity project. Can you imagine? He was practicing stewardship. Secondly, we take care of, or we steward people's safety needs when we guard them. That's another thing the psalmist refers to, guarding. Guarding people is a very important task in the ancient world because people were so vulnerable to foreign armies and just bandits, generally speaking. Now, the modern equivalent of the folks who stood guard in the towers of ancient cities are obviously our police officers, security guards, the National Guard, and our larger military. And only the most ardent of pacifists would reject all those forms of security. Most people understand there is a need for some kind of security on some level. Now, the third thing the psalmist mentions is he talks about is working. Working is a general description of things that we do to take care of, or we steward many things. My job, for example, is to take care of my flock, to steward my flock. And all of you who have ever had a job of any kind are or were performing some kind of stewardship function. Whether you were taking care of medical patients, students, if you're a teacher, maybe you worked in some office, so you're taking care of the office, or technological needs, or you build things like roads or houses or bridges or any number of tasks that meets some kind of need. If you're taking care of a need, then you, generally speaking, you're engaging in an act of stewardship. So working is an act of stewardship for the most part. And then finally, the psalmist includes taking care of children as a stewardship activity. And that's an obvious point, unless you raise children the way I raise children. I hope this doesn't disturb you, but I had a particular parenting philosophy that I learned to appreciate early on, and it can be summed up in 2 words: benign neglect. That was the way I parented. I'm just kidding. Some days it was true, though. So let's dive a little deeper into Psalm 127. The psalmist doesn't just list these 4 activities of building and guarding and working and raising children. He says some fairly interesting things about them. First, he writes that unless the Lord build the house, or unless the Lord guards the city, then these things are done in vain. I find that to be very interesting because obviously people do such things as build houses and guard cities. God doesn't literally do those things. So what does the psalmist mean by this? Well, here's what I think the writer is trying to say. Any and every activity is purposeless unless it is oriented to God. Any and every activity is purposeless unless it is oriented to God. Now that's a big statement, right? But what the psalmist is trying to say, that if we are building things or if we are guarding things, it is in vain unless it is something that God wants us to do. And the same principle, of course, applies to our work, our vocation, our jobs. The psalmist says that if we rise up early to go to work, engaging in anxious toil, this is also in vain, he says. And the implication, I think what he's trying to say, is that unless our work is somehow oriented to God, then there's no reason to get out of bed in the morning. No matter what it is, if it's not for God in some way, don't need to get out of bed in the morning. And that's an interesting concept. How many of you think of your work, maybe what you did in the past or you do now, as something that was oriented to God? Now, on the surface, you may not think that, right? You may think, well, my job had nothing to do with God. But notice the word vocation. Vocation is a word we use to refer to our job, our career, or anything like that. That word is interesting. It comes from a Latin word that means a call or a summons. This suggests that our vocation is an occupation to which we are specially drawn, or for which we are best suited, or trained, or qualified. And it has a religious connotation because we are called to do something. Although the word vocation is often used to refer to vocations that don't seem to have a religious purpose, the meaning of the word originated from the church. It came from Christianity. So from a Christian perspective, all vocations, no matter what you do now or did in the past, all vocations, if they're legitimate, are a call from God. Think about that. They are a call from God. And so this should cause us to reflect seriously on what we do or what we did for our occupations. If our jobs, in other words, are not performing some act of stewardship, taking care of some need, then according to the writer of Psalm 127, that occupation is in vain. There's no reason to get up in the morning if it doesn't do that. It's in vain. By the way, one of my favorite childhood songs was Carly Simon's 1972 hit, You're So Vain. You're so vain, you probably think this song is about you. How many of you think this sermon's about you, by the way? It is. It's about all of us. It really is. Now, the message of the first half of Psalm 27 is about not doing things in vain. That is, whatever we do, whether we're building houses or fixing automobiles or guarding cities or caring for our patients, whatever it is, if it's not oriented to God in some way, then it's in vain. That's the message of the first half of the psalm. The second half, the message of the second half is a little trickier, and it needs a little bit explaining, which I'm going to provide for you. We have to read it through our modern lens. I'm going to read this to you again. This is from the New Revised Standard Version. Sons. By the way, the version I read to you earlier is more contemporary, so it used the word children. But in the original language, it used the word sons, not daughters. Sons are indeed a heritage from the Lord, the fruit of the womb a reward. Like arrows in the hand of a warrior are the sons of one's youth. Happy is the man, not the woman, happy is the man who has his quiver full of them sons. He shall not be put to shame when he speaks with his enemies in the gate. That last statement about speaking to enemies at the gate, this probably refers to the fact that having a lot of sons brought a family and a town or village greater security or greater protection from their enemies. If you have more sons that can get up there and guard the city, that's a good thing. So here the psalmist is referring back to the stewardship act of guarding. But the literal message of this part of Psalm 127 is that having sons is a blessing from God. How many of you have had sons? I just want to know. How many of you? A lot of you. Were they a blessing? Seriously. If I ask about daughters, it'd be different, wouldn't it? I'm speaking for myself. Now, obviously, we shouldn't take this too literally because we don't want to imply that daughters are not a blessing, and we don't want to imply that people who remain childless are somehow less blessed than those who have children. I mean, we don't really think that way today. So when we say children are a blessing, we mean it in a general way. Yeah, they're a blessing. Not in a theological sense that God is actually saying, if you have sons, you are blessed. If you have daughters, not so much. If you don't have any children, you're really not blessed. No, it's just in a general way. Yeah, children are a blessing. And as a parent, I will say there have been many times in my life when I hate to say I didn't think children were that much of a blessing, to be honest with you. But for the most part, we got to have kids to carry on the human race, so I'm cool with children, okay? They're good. But the statement, this is interesting to me. I have to say, this is the first time I'd really delved deeply into Psalm 127, so I was excited about it. I'm kind of a Bible nerd, right? But this statement about the man having a quiver full of sons is responsible for a very interesting Christian sort of fundamentalist movement in the United States of America and elsewhere. It's a movement, it's called Quiverful. How many of you have heard of Quiverful? Yeah, you've heard of it. Not many though, right? But you're about to understand that you have heard of it. A quiver, of course, is a container for the arrows, right? You just keep pulling them out and shooting things. And so to have a quiver full of sons is like having a lot of arrows, right? That's what he's referring to. So the Quiverful movement in the United States and elsewhere is a movement, it's a Christian movement that sees children as a blessing from God. We're good with that. And it promotes procreation. Lots and lots of procreation. It rejects all forms of birth control, every form of birth control. So you have as many kids as you can. And so currently there are several thousand Christians worldwide who identify with the Quiverful movement, including, do you know who I'm going to mention now? The Duggars. 19 kids and counting. Is she pregnant again, by the way, or they just say that? 19 kids and counting. The Duggar family, I'm sure most of you have heard of them, primarily because recently they've gotten a little criticism because one of their sons, they discovered had molested some of his sisters and their friends when he was younger. And also, to make matters worse, he was caught having not one but two accounts on the adultery website called Ashley Madison. So by saying that, I don't mean to imply that everyone in the Quiverful movement is bad, but I do think it is an example of how we can misinterpret and misuse the Bible in a way that is not good stewardship and can lead to bad results. In the ancient world, and even in the not too distant past in rural America, right? And some of you came from larger families, or you had many children years ago. In the not too distant past, it could be construed as good stewardship to have many children because they were needed as maybe as farmhands or as resources for their parents in a society without an adequate social safety net for elderly people. Today, however, having many children is not always good stewardship, primarily because it is more difficult to take care of the family if your resources are spread too thin. And we don't have the need as we once did to have many, many children. So I just thought that was kind of an interesting connection with Psalm 127. So the writer of Psalm 127 is reflecting good stewardship for his time and place. And that's what really the message of the psalm. And that's what we should be doing for our time and place, whatever that means. So we should be asking ourselves the following questions. How are we taking care of what needs taking care of? How are we doing that? Are we building, guarding, working, raising children, or any and all of our duties in a way that is oriented to God? That is, in a way that reflects the principles of good stewardship? Well, today is the day to ask those questions. Let us pray.